Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand. I'm Panu Wongchum, the club president and senior correspondent for Reuters. We have this privilege to welcome two authors from Hong Kong this afternoon to talk about their upcoming book, so it's not out yet, called The Geopolitics of Artificial Intelligence, printed by the Cambridge University Press. Now, artificial intelligence is no longer merely a technical tool. It is rapidly reshaping global power, competition, and cooperation. Geopolitics of Artificial Intelligence, the book, explores how AI is transforming relations between states, corporations, and societies, creating significant economic and governance opportunities while also generating new risk, from intensifying geopolitical rivalries to the erosion of global cooperation and threats to sovereignty and democratic self-determination. This book argues that existing political and regulatory frameworks are ill-equipped to address these challenges, as AI risks and geopolitical tensions increasingly reinforce one another, often driven by powerful non-state actors like tech companies. So I want to briefly introduce the two speakers. First, on my right, Professor Boris Babik, Associate Professor of Data Science, Philosophy and Law at the University of Hong Kong, and a Principal Investigator at the AI and Humanity Lab. His research focuses on the ethics, law, and policy of artificial intelligence, including generative AI, and has been published in leading journals such as Science and Nature Machine Intelligence. And to his right, my old friend Brian Wong, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong as well, and a non-resident honorary fellow at the Asia Society Center for China Analysis. A Rhodes Scholar, his research spans geopolitics, technology, ethics, and authoritarian governance, and his commentary on China and Asian geopolitics regularly appears in leading international media. Boris and Brian, welcome to the FCCT. So we'll start the talk actually after some discussion. We're going to do this talk in sort of a Q&A format, if you like. So I'm going to have about 4 or 5 questions to both of them, and then I'm going to throw the question to you guys, to the floor, to ask them after that. So let's start with a simple kind of question, Boris and Brian, why this book? Isn't geopolitics a domain of raw and brute interest? Why approaching it from a philosophical point of view? Please.
Well, first of all, on behalf of Boris and myself, I just want to thank you, Panu, and thank all of you for being here today. It's really a privilege and an honor to be addressing the FCC community. There's a fantastic FCC in Hong Kong as well that does incredibly important work, and I really do hope that times like these we can, just applaud, and I applaud personally the efforts and the work of independent journalists around the world, and especially in this part of the world, on the line of work that you do. In terms of the purpose and the objective of this book and why exactly we need to talk about philosophy and ethics in the context of geopolitics, I think there are broadly 3 observations I make. And the underlying convergence here is that what we might construe as the realm of just purely naked and brute interests is in fact laden with questions concerning what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust, and what exactly ought we do as independent stakeholders with skin in the game. And very quickly, then, the first question concerns responsibility, whether it be the deployment of AI when it comes to military drones and also long-distance remote campaigns of assassinations and decapitations, or alternatively, the employment of algorithms in identifying suspected targets for search and detention and arrests, and even indeed when it comes to the embedment of AI in healthcare systems, in infrastructural planning, and governmental public policy making decisions on an international and regional level. These are all decisional moments that exist in a status quo, and yet we don't ask questions about who's calling the shots, or indeed about who's responsible for the veracity and the accuracy of these decisions, such that when things go awry, for instance, if there's an individual that's wrongly assassinated and killed with an AI-enabled drone, who's to bear responsibility in the status quo? Well, the answer is, well, the structure is at fault here. Individuals are not at fault, so we can't really hold anyone responsible. But as we all know, this turn towards structure is merely a thinly disguised means of shirking responsibility and running away from accountability on the part of large governments and corporations as well. And that, I think, is normatively erroneous and deeply unjust. The second question concerns, of course, access. For AI does bring about, don't get me wrong, lots of dividends and benefits from writing articles and composing essays, and we know that from marking our students' ersatz submissions, to dealing with, of course, the influx of information and how to process and streamline information and organize it in a way that's more digestible. AI delivers lots of goods and dividends, even for government as well. Planning, resource allocation, innovation, closing the gap of resources between powerful and less powerful countries in theory. And yet the trouble is, in the status quo, AI access is not even. It is not equal. It is not the case that wherever you're born in the world today, you can just switch on your mobile phone and free of charge access AI as is, even though that's a narrative that's often sold to us only, if anything, to justify the advent of the hyper-commercialization and also incredibly exorbitant sums of valuation money being poured into AI companies and behemoths. That, I think, is also a normative question, not just an empirical question when it comes to what we ought to do in relation to making AI more accessible and globally equitable in terms of the usage, norm setting, and rule and agenda setting as well. And finally, on interests, and this is where I'm going to defer to my learned colleague, Boris, we tend to think of AI on a global level these days as a race, as a competition. Now, Boris is going to explain why that's the wrong way of looking at it. But I would just say, what exactly do we mean by the statement, China is going to win, or the US is losing, or the EU is going to lose out? I mean, these entities don't actually exist in reality. And why do they say that? Because you can't point to a physical entity and call it the EU, just like you wouldn't be able to walk on the streets of Oxford and say, this is University of Oxford. For Gilbert Ryle points out quite clearly, this is a category mistake. And why is that the case? Because ultimately these are denotions and representations. So when we speak of America, are we talking here about the Bill Gates, the Bezos, and those implicated in the absolutely heinous files that were released a couple of weeks ago, or rather a month or two ago? Are we speaking of the ordinary working class member of the Appalachian community who's lost a job as a result of a mixture of automation and economic modernization and now sees China as the boogeyman? Or are we speaking here instead about the middle class academic working in UCLA who has to deal with a tyranny and also repression directed towards them by certain individuals sitting in a particular White House? I mean, these are all questions we have to answer. Whose interests matter more? Whose interests matter less? And you can't answer this without invoking ethics and philosophy as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over the floor to Boris to continue the conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thank you all for being here and having us. It's likewise a pleasure to be at the FCCT. So I'm a decision theorist. I'm interested in rational choice and sort of like analysis of incentives and analysis of self-interest. So in response to kind of like the general question of where philosophy comes in, I think it is immediately relevant even to the analysis of brute interests. The difference between what we do as philosophers and what one might do as an economist is that we think a little bit more about the normative assumptions that underlie any given model. Not that the economic approach is better or worse, but we sort of focus less on the mathematical derivations and more on like what's the right framing that we should have when we think about a decision theoretic model of some kind of interaction. And in this particular case, I think there's just quite a lot of not even misinformation, like harmful information in the public domain about the relevant interests and the relevant, basically, like strategic position of different regimes. Just last month, Dario Amodei published this like rambling 20,000 plus word essay on his blog, which goes on to describe how the CPC is the biggest threat to the Western world, I guess, and how the big AI companies in the U.S. must win the AI race, which is a theme that he's been developing throughout the last 2 years. And part of what we do in this book on the rational choice side is really to try and dispel this myth that there is an AI race. I think the race narrative is really harmful. There are kind of like typical races. One can think about the space race between the US and the Soviet Union as a fairly described as a race. It's kind of like who gets to the moon first, and it's clear how you win that race, and it's clear how you lose that race, and you can think about the soft benefits that come from winning it, and so on and so forth. But in the context of AI, that this technology has been around for decades. There aren't really any IP secrets here or something like that. So there's all of this misinformation about how we have to really closely guard the technology, even though it's all just like very well-known statistical learning theory. What it is to win that is not clear. And so that's what we try to spell out in the book, and we do it a little bit systematically as a kind of game theoretic approach. It's like, well, what would be the Nash equilibrium here? Is it cooperative or non-cooperative? And we try to argue the kind of like socially optimal outcome is indeed a cooperative one. So this race framing is just actively harmful. And so we think philosophy has quite a lot to contribute to this discussion.
So, I mean, to take that further, if it's not a race, as being categorized and framed, U.S., China, along those lines, then what concrete example can you show, like, in terms of what it is, where these races, obviously, to develop, and harness sort of AI capacity and capability of all these countries and tech firms, where it is leading to then? Either of you. Yeah.
So I can start with just a little bit of a background of the analogy that we'd like to give. A typical kind of like game theoretic race is, well, like a literal race or something, like a game of chicken. Like in Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean is racing against his nemesis toward a tunnel, and only one of them can, or toward a cliff actually in the movie. And so only one of them can win. They can't both win. If the other guy is going to keep driving, you really have to swear off because you don't want to die too. If you know that your opponent is going to veer, then you should drive because it's better for you to win than to lose. So that's like a clear race. And then the analogy that we give for how sort of AI dynamics look at the geopolitical level is a so-called stag hunt game, which perhaps some of you, if you're familiar with game theory, would have heard of. It's a very kind of like common game theoretic model, but the basic setup of this game is we are in a kind of like hunter-gatherer society, and we have to choose whether to hunt a large animal or whether to hunt a small animal like a rabbit. If we hunt a large animal, we have to work together. If I just hunt a rabbit, I can catch it alone. So now, if we both cooperate, that's Nash equilibrium. If neither of us cooperate, that's also Nash equilibrium. But one of those is better than the other. I would prefer to be in the equilibrium where we cooperate and catch the bigger animal. But if you're going to hunt a rabbit, then I have to just hunt a rabbit too. So the nice thing about this game is that it's actually rational to get stuck in both. If we're hunting rabbits, then you should hunt a rabbit. You shouldn't change your strategy. But it's socially better for us to cooperate. And that's the situation that we think characterizes AI dynamics at the global level, which is that if research labs, if states, if they cooperate on trade, on semiconductors, on precious metals, etc., then that's all around better for everyone. It may not be better for individual firms, but at a social level, it's socially optimal. And now we're stuck in that rabbit hunting equilibrium, which is that you have export controls, you have trade barriers, etc., and you don't have an incentive to deviate if you think that your competitor won't deviate either.
If I could just add a few points of supplementary commentary. The first point I want to really home in on is what exactly do we mean by an AI race, right? So I'm sure many of you have seen the term, the race, the global AI race, the competition, the rivalry, the race of the century. But what exactly is this race? What are we racing towards here? What are we racing along the dimensions of? Who's racing in this? Is it just China and the US? For that seems to leave out the remaining 80% of the world, including the European Union, which is not just a regulatory entity or power, CF Brussels effect, but it's also an important vanguard of values about protecting individual liberties and rights and interests against the state-centered sort of top-down authoritarianism of one power and a kind of market-fueled oligopoly captured kind of policy making and lobbying politics you see another, right? So surely the world is more than just a two-player game. That's a pretty straightforward observation. But also, I would ask, I would make the following suggestion. We don't really call, right, this sort of mindless pursuit of unclear objectives between viciously opposed players a race under any other context in our everyday lives. We might call it a messy divorce. We might call it embittered bickering. We might call it, power and ego-fueled craze. We wouldn't call it a race, for it's not clear what the destination is. And now, of course, some folks would say, no, artificial general intelligence, that's the holy grail, right? And just to give you guys some context, AGI, artificial general intelligence, purportedly refers to a state where AI is capable of replicating and performing vast swaths of the kind of functions that humans currently perform, and therefore is presumably able to replicate humans or replace humans, whatever that's supposed to mean, according to those who want to feel the AGI. But the trouble here is, it's not entirely clear to us if the countries we're speaking of here, China, America, Germany, Israel, India, are indeed racing towards AGI. Sure, you've got a handful of companies in America and maybe one or two companies in China increasingly taking after the counterparts in the States and framing their research as oriented towards AGI. But by and large, it's unclear if securitization and militarization of AI has all that much to do with AGI and the status quo. So if artificial general intelligence is in fact an objective that is desirable, and that's a big if, it's unclear if these countries that we're speaking of here are indeed prizing that as a holy grail. And I would indeed ask if it's in fact desirable for AI to be able to perform 95 to 100% of our functions just as intelligibly and cohesively as human beings. Is that a desirable state of world? What would that actually mean for employment, or for human productivity, or more importantly for those who cannot access the reskilling, the training, the education resources, and the privilege and wherewithal in order to allow for them to survive this onslaught of artificial general intelligence? So my second question here is, I don't think there's a race, because a race presumes a shared point of destination, or at least some semblance of convergence towards the end. That's not present in the status quo, and even if it is, it frankly is a pretty scary thought that we've got countries and companies racing towards basically recreating humans, making man happen, and speaking the words of Zarathustra in the 21st century, as opposed to from a millennium or 2 millennia ago. And a final note I'm just going to throw into the mixture here as to why I'm skeptical. It's fundamentally unclear if the risks are in fact worth it, right? So a race is worth it if the prize is so significant that we can just dedicate and pour in all the resources we have and mobilize all the resources there are in order to achieve the Holy Grail. But yet, if we look at what's actually unfolding today, whether it be in China or the States or even parts of Europe, we're essentially seeing private actors, non-state actors, non-democratically elected actors, spearheading a huge amount of resources amassed, whether it be through market or state-led investment mechanisms, and pushing all the capital towards opaque ends, with no accountability, with impunity over the actions, with no real redress on the part of ordinary citizens like you and I here sitting in this room. And we are already amongst ourselves more literate and more engaged and more plugged in than the average Joe on the streets. And 95% of those who have to put up with the consequences of what these billionaires, or what these powerful strongmen decide to do with AI. I don't think the risks, that arise from cooperation or the risks that arise from non-cooperation and from this competition are something that we're quite aware of or can even grasp and put a number on just yet. And yet, if all we are here is we're blinded by this belief that the race is something we have to adhere to, then this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. For indeed, when one party decides to increase opacity concerning the military prowess and the AI militarization levels, then the other parties in this system would correspondingly respond by escalating and doubling down on militarization. That explains the classic sort of security dilemma as applied to the context of AI today. So Boris and I find these phenomena and these trends rather disturbing, and would end perhaps our answer to your question, Panu, on the final comment here. At the end of the day, the effects of unbridled AI development, whether it be climate change or runaway AI or unaccountable AI being used in military contexts, the harms of such usages are asymmetrically concentrated in the bottom 90% of the economic ladder, whereas the benefits that accrued would largely be accrued to maybe the top 0.01% of shareholders, but also additionally, of course, the upper middle class who are more entrepreneurial, the kind of laptop-carrying elite that Patrick Deneen writes of, in his characterizations of the crises of our times and the malaise of this era. But what about the remaining 90%? What about the folks out there who do not know the difference between AGI, ASI, API, whatever you have it? If they can't even name the problem, if they can't even name the reality, how can they then speak truth to power, let alone hold powers accountable? So that, I think, is why I'm quite skeptical of the race-centered framing and narrative as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to, one more question to both of you before I turn over to the floor. I mean, listening to you, both of you talking about sort of, this sort of kind of misframe of the race and also, so in terms of policymakers, and what can policymakers do? What have they got wrong? And, I'm not talking about just, obviously consequential, US, China, big tech firm. I'm talking also about sort of the middle power, the other countries, the small states. What's that? What do they have to do here to understand or to really reframe the situation when it comes to AI? And looking at sort of the synopsis of your book and so on that when I was preparing for this, what do you guys propose then in terms of an alternative sort of framework, global framework? You're talking about how existing regulatory framework is not, maybe not sufficient. Maybe there's some sort of, what should there be then, in place to kind of make AI more equitable, more just, and so on and so forth.
I have
so 2 parts, yeah. So
okay,
please.
Yeah, thank you. I have a quick comment, and then Brian, you can speak more about the policy question. My quick comment is just that frontier AI labs in the U.S., I think, just have a scary amount of influence over current foreign policy. It's like what the military-industrial complex used to be, but they really drive the discussion on how the regulation should look, and somehow just get very little pushback and a lot of deference. I don't really understand it fully, and it feels like we've been duped into thinking that okay, we have to do what they sort of say is essential. I'm glad that Brian brought up this notion of AGI, which is it's not really a thing. Well, what is it? It's not a mathematically well-defined concept. It's just I don't know what AGI is for humans, let alone for algorithmic systems. But somehow we've been sold this narrative that well, you really have to rush toward it, you have to invest maximally toward it, and you have to prevent the other guy from getting there first, right? And a lot of the AI frontier labs now are also cooperating with explicitly military companies that develop autonomous weapons, etc. And that's even more dangerous. So, I mean, I just think that governments should be very careful about taking their foreign policy advice from companies who have a very obvious self-interest to pitch a certain narrative.
Yeah, so I want to start by noting, actually, despite everything I've said up until this point, there's more agency on the part of middle powers beyond the giants, the 2 giants in the room, than we'd like to give them credit for. So I'll just run through a few stats here. ASEAN as a region, with 11 members now and almost 700 million individuals in the region, average median age of 30.3 years old. ASEAN produces over 25% of the world's semiconductor supply, or at least core components in supply chains, as well as possessing around 21% of the world's rare earth reserves. And if you throw in other critical raw materials that matter in a renewable transition as defined by the EU as well, we'd easily push that number up to 26 to 27%. That's a lot of, potential materials utile in this very transition and quote-unquote race that we're speaking of here. And that's why I think it's absolutely understandable that ASEAN states are now seeking to court the US and to bring in American companies and investment as well in these areas, as opposed to relying exclusively upon Chinese capital and investment. Diversification and hedging is a must. Second piece of framing, if we turn our attention to the Gulf, Saudi Arabia recently came up with this slogan where they said, we'd like to become the 3rd AI power in the world. And of course, the instinctive reaction to most things coming out of Saudi Arabia, whether it be commentaries on, state of civil and political liberties, or alternatively, the state of AI policy making might be one of skepticism. You might say, this is all just propaganda. But the truth of the matter is, whether it be in solar energy, to some extent wind energy, but of course, by and large, the elephant in the room being non-renewable energy sources. The Saudis are sitting on, a pretty sizable and significant reserve of energy that we need to power. And why do we need energy for the AI race? Simple, to power data centers, to power computational processes, to support the development of these very prominent LLMs, if LLMs are indeed, as some folks might put it, a path towards AI consciousness, or not. If you don't believe in LLMs, that's also fine. But what the Saudis are trying to do here is to turn the rich, non-renewable energy reserves they have right now, which could well become a liability in 30 years' time, into something that could power their AI growth and development, not just in the region, but also that puts them in good stead on an international level. Then there's also the European Union, which again, I always tell my European diplomatic friends and academic counterparts, you've got it, you've just got to believe, right? It's easy to talk down and look down upon the EU these days and think, oh, it's just bureaucracy, Draghi's put the death knell, it's a death sentence. But the Draghi report was less a death sentence and more a wake-up call in my view, that when coupled with the most expensive and rudest breakup speech I've ever heard from anyone, namely J.D. Vance's speech at Munich Security Conference last year, that should have been enough, in my view, to wake up the European states and also governments. It's imperative for them to develop their own sovereign AI, independent from influence and capture by the Russians, by the Chinese, and of course, by the Americans, or rather the American state apparatus, which I think is different from the American population. And I want to sort of highlight this distinction here again. And it's imperative that we, as Europeans, that we focus on building up our own sovereign and self-sufficient AI capacities where possible, and if not possible, reach out via plurilateral institutions to the African Union, to Latin America, to ASEAN, to find the resources and components we need to build our semiconductor supply chains and also AI supply chains as well. Sure, it's not possible for you to wean yourselves entirely off, of course, Chinese, or American or Japanese technologies, but the least we could do is to have a coalition of middle powers and a coalition of other poles in this quote-unquote increasingly multipolar world to stand up and say, we're not going to take it from Washington or from Beijing, what our countries and our people is going to lead their lives as, and how we're going to live. This is a matter of our own decision and also our autonomous decision-making and self-determination processes, so to speak. So I guess the first comment I make is about building up a coalition of the willing and acknowledging that we really have more prowess and resources in our hands than we'd like to perhaps admit on surface or upon first glance. The second and briefer comment I have concerns what about the folks living in China and America today? What exactly should and can they do? Now, of course, on surface, the structural differences are pretty clear. China's not a democracy. The US is a democracy. In China, you cannot vote for the head of state or the head of government or indeed senior leaders. In America, you can elect representatives who can then in turn participate in a very important occasion where they then indirectly represent your will in voting for candidates coming from a very representative range of backgrounds. Namely, they come from, instead of one party, which you have in China, they come from two parties. So therefore, in America, democracy is alive and well. I'm sorry, I should have signed for Blackadder. I'm just kidding. No. So in short, of course America is more democratic than China by all political measures and counts, and yet I would posit that the regime type is perhaps less important than the relative power disparity between the policy and political elite and the ordinary citizens. And that is in turn a problem that exists across both China and the US, right? Whether it be the formal obstacles to participation in China or the indirect, non-formalized but substantive and de facto barriers to participation in politics in the US. These are existing constraints and bottlenecks that exist. And of course, we'd sit here all day long complaining about this, whether it be in relation to authoritarianism in one or in relation to muddy politics in the other. But I would submit that if we are truly trying to implement changes and reform institutions to align them with AI justice, AI equity, and AI access, we've got to be pragmatic. We've got to work with the systems that exist and seek creative means of basically pushing the agenda forward. So in the States, it might basically imply, pushing forward narratives that play off these AI companies against one another, that call them out for the dearth of scrutiny and internal checks and balances, empowering individual public intellectuals who want to talk about the excesses of these companies, whilst also acknowledging that you need to work with these regulatory teams and policy-making teams in these companies in order to make AI safety actually a thing. And symmetrically in China, which is of course not a democratically open or indeed participatorily accessible government, what's needed there is what Kevin O'Brien and Li Lianjiang, I think, term rightful disobedience or rightful resistance. And that is essentially finding channels and also pathways within the systems that exist and convincing provincial level municipal level and local level stakeholders to see the merits and the virtues of installing guardrails when it comes to AI development. And you might say this is naive, this is never going to happen. And yet, the fact of the matter is AI safety would never have been thought of a term that would crop up in Chinese official party documents 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And of course, even 5 years back, AI safety was largely framed through just the lenses of ideological and content security. And yet, over the past 18 to 24 months, what we've seen coming out from Beijing is a clear sign that even, as fundamentally removed and insulated from the public as the leaders might be in Beijing, they are cognizant of the effects of AI on unemployment. They are not unaware of the dangers of operating at breakneck speed, as this wonderful author's book is aptly titled, when it comes to AI automation. And that is why, in the upcoming 15 five-year plan, we should expect more measures targeting questions of structural unemployment, as well as retraining and reskilling, even though I have my doubts about the efficacy of such measures. And so there are promising signs that these great and often, dare I say, self-absorbed power centers in the world are thinking about the perils of AI. But the question is, how can we creatively leverage the openings there, as limited as they may be, to try and drive forward more pragmatic and also reasonable AI regulations and policies? And that's a question I think all of us here and beyond would have to think about, leveraging our resources and wherewithal as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Boris. I'm going to turn over to the floor now. There's a mic at the back. Please go up there and identify yourself, your name, your affiliation, and please stick to questions. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Panu. Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Imtiaz Muqbil. I'm a life member of the club. I actually cover the travel and tourism industry. There's a lot of concern about the impact of travel and tourism, about the impact on travel and tourism of the AI revolution. But today my question is not about that. It's really basically just to follow up some of the comments that you have made on the lack of accountability. I guess the question that I have is, do people like you all have a seat at the table when it comes to putting out the alternative perspective, the philosophical perspective? And if you do not have a seat at the table, how do you see some of these changes, some of the potential solutions actually going forward? Because what it seems to me is that there is it's a sinister Orwellian world that is emerging. And unless you all have a seat at the table, it's going to be very, very difficult to bring about the counter side of the perspective and some of the solutions that you're proposing. Thank you.
One important way in which we don't have a seat at the table is this turn away from open source development of the last 5 years. It roughly corresponds with basically the emergence of OpenAI as the frontier of the most closed model development, ironically. But when the models are completely proprietary and they're being developed, when the leading kind of like work is coming from private firms that keep all of this stuff secret, then it's really hard to think seriously about accountability. I mean, there's a kind of naive way in which we have a seat at the table. There's sort of NGOs and think tanks and government organizations where one can have a voice, but I think it's really damaging that the core kind of like development is happening in a way that is not at all open source, at least in the US actually. DeepSeek is the most open model. And that's kind of surprising to me. I would say like 10 years ago, there was a sense that the future is going to be completely open source. In the statistical world, we were kind of moving away from SPSS and SAS and all of these proprietary coding, basically computational systems for doing statistics, towards R and Python and things that were just like leading development platforms that were completely open. And my prediction would have been like, yeah, that's obviously going to be the future. And then about 5 years ago, we went in the other direction.
So I agree with Boris's pretty somber assessment of what's going on, in the status quo. But if I could just perhaps offer a slightly more optimistic take concerning where folks like ourselves do have a say. By and large, when it comes to middle powers in the room, especially, from first-hand experience, many ASEAN governments, they have a lot of curiosity and interest in AI. And I don't think, their views on what they ought to do with AI, both domestically and internationally, are settled. As Natasha Bedingfield put it, the best is unwritten. Sorry, that was a bit of a niche reference, but I hope you understood. It is unwritten. It's unwritten in the sense that we can write it. And so I myself have had the pleasure of traveling through to Phnom Penh, but also to Kuala Lumpur, where I've delivered workshops. In fact, Boris and I went to Phnom Penh together to deliver workshops to government officials on AI governance and safety, trying to explain notions of safety to them and why it's imperative they have researchers looking at alignment risks, looking at privacy violations, looking at risks of other countries through prompt engineering otherwise interfering with their own sovereign AI infrastructure and digital infrastructure, thereby undermining their own, of course, ability to self-determine policies appropriately. These are all areas that are blank, and therefore these blank spaces, again, itself a very important opportunity, I'd say, for academics, for policymakers, for researchers to try and fill the niche and to also work collaboratively with counterparts in building up capacities. But even in larger economies, I would posit that the private sectors in both China and the US have had relatively sluggish uptake of AI. And I know this sounds a bit controversial, but if you look at the actual numbers in China, corporations using AI on C2B, or B2C rather, operations, you've got a penetration rate around 80 to 90%, right? That's especially in a case of, say, courier services, delivery services, advertisements, and micro-targeting services. And you might observe similar trends to lesser extent in the States as well. But when it comes to corporate uptake of AI within companies, so C2C or infra-C uptake, it's very sluggish in China. And that's because corporations don't see necessarily the merit or the virtue of streamlining management processes and optimizing their performance through the introduction of AI. And by and large, AI is therefore asymmetrically concentrated in the sort of corporation or business through to consumer dimension of the economy. So how exactly can we advise these individuals and nudge them, hopefully, in a more responsible and conscientious direction? That's an open question. That's also, again, unanswered and unwritten as well. Now, finally, of course, in the hard military, geopolitical sort of risk stuff that we talked about at the start of this conversation. So I'll be honest, right? I don't think Boris and I would have the ability in the next 5 years to influence directly how Beijing or Washington or even Brussels, are thinking about the regulation of AI usage and adoption in military contexts and warfare settings. But I'm sure there are many other colleagues of ours out there who are trying. And more importantly, even if we can't do it ourselves, what we can at least try to do is to convene spaces. And that's why, if I may, and I don't want to come across as advertising a conference, but in 2 months' time in Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong is going to convene the inaugural Hong Kong Global AI Governance Conference. We'll bring in voices and academics, as well as former and current policymakers from the States, from Canada, from the UK, as well as India, and vast swaths of Southeast Asia, the Gulf, Central Asia, and of course China, to assemble them in Hong Kong to talk about areas where cooperation can still be found. And of course, an important medium and vehicle here is higher education. Higher education gets a bad rep these days, right? Whether it be the backlash against quote-unquote so-called woke culture, which again is a very nebulously constructed term, whatever that's supposed to mean in the States. Alternatively, the perception that certain countries weaponize higher education as a means of foreign infiltration and interference. And yet, despite all these calamities and predicaments that exist, what I do think we need to do is to give higher education administrators and academics credit where credit's due. And that is to say, they are also the individuals who are most willing to, when walls are being built, when roads are being blocked, when bridges are being burnt, to still hold the fort for international cooperation and dialogue on issues that matter to everyone, regardless of where we are: climate change, public health, and artificial intelligence. So that's my more optimistic spin on Boris's very frank and honest answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Please.
Good afternoon. My name's Callum Chase. I'm a co-founder of an AI startup and author of a few books on the future of AI. And in fact, next Thursday, I'm giving a talk on the future of AI right here. I have a question, but I just want to start by maybe offering you an answer, Boris, to your question of why the big tech companies are so influential in US policy at the moment. And I think the answer is very obvious. The president is a crook, and they've offered him bribes. Amazon paid whatever it was, 45 million for a ludicrous documentary about his wife, and it's got them in his good books. I think it's pretty straightforward. My question starts here that I'm puzzled as to whether you think there is an AI race or not, because you started by saying there isn't, and then you gave a very good account of exactly why there is, which is that the leaders of big AI all believe that we are collectively heading towards AGI and superintelligence. It's actually worth trying to nail down what they mean. It's very simple. A superintelligent AI is an AI which can do everything that a human can do and better. So there's absolutely nothing cognitively that a human can do and the smartest human can do that a machine can't do better. So they all believe that they are racing towards this. They believe it's a zero-sum game. The person who gets there first wins all the prizes. And there is a goal. So it is a race. And the prizes that they win are incredible, because if you are the first person with superintelligence, you own the global economy, all of it. So I'm a bit puzzled about whether you think there is one or not. But my real question is this. Do you believe that we are heading towards superintelligence? And if so, do you think it's a good thing?
Please.
Yeah, so this definition that AI can do everything that a human can do as a definition of superintelligence, consider like mathematical reasoning. So if a model can answer mathematical questions and sort of high-level ones, sometimes very high-level ones, very well. And if you ask a chain of thought model, like, how did you derive this answer? It tells you, like, here's what I did. And it gives you a step-by-step explanation of what it did. And yet we know that that can't be what it did. It's not faithful to the internal architecture of the system. We know that because of the way that digits are tokenized and the way that operations, the way that we do operations and the way that one would have to do multiplication operations, for example, as an LLM model. So there's a sense in which, like, this internal representation in architecture is quite important, even if the answer is right. So even if on the face of things, they're doing the same thing, it seems, and they're doing it better, actually it can still be problematic if what's going on the inside is quite different. So I think the cognitive dimension matters quite a bit. Why does it matter? Well, it matters there's a sense of robustness in which it matters. So Bertrand Russell has this analogy where he says, it's a sort of internalism, externalism in philosophy, but he uses the notion of, actually the modern example is a turkey before Thanksgiving. The turkey before Thanksgiving, every day its owner feeds it, and so the turkey thinks like, wow, my owner really loves me, as he's fattening it up towards Thanksgiving. And so every single day, the outward evidence seems to be like, wow, this is like really great, until of course the turkey is slaughtered. Like, for example, reasoning with an AI model, it can look indistinguishable from humans until it's not indistinguishable. And that's why I think understanding the internal architecture is important, but then defining superintelligence in terms of just indistinguishable outward performance can be problematic. So I'm still not sure how one defines superintelligence or AGI. I would not define it in terms of purely empirically observable behavior.
Thank you very much for your great questions. And of course, I was going to ask Panu if I could be invited to just gate crash your wonderful talk, actually looking forward to learning more from you as well, with his permission. But I've got two quick answers to your very well thought out question. The first is on the race narrative itself, and the second is on superintelligence. So my submission here is the race narrative is not an empirical and scientific description. It is a political choice. It is a conscious choice opted for and adopted by corporations, by money politics, by lobbyists, by powerful voices with vested interests, with skin in the game, not just in the States, not just in China, but also across all parts of the world that say we need a race towards AGI. So I agree with you insofar that there exists this narrative that's propagated by a combination of media voices, technologists, quote-unquote technologists, and of course venture capital folks who benefit from what I call the unlimited and unbridled ballooning of valuations that we see these days in relation to AI labs. Now it's what, $500 billion. 2 years' time, $2 trillion. 4 years' time, $8 trillion. Anything at all to justify quantitative easing, am I right? But anyway, what I do want to say here, though, is that this is not a narrative that we need to, as those who do not belong to that particular exclusive clique of individuals. Let's call them the members of the AGI island. We don't need to identify ourselves with members of this island, just like we shouldn't stand with those who abetted the injustices that took place on another island, so to speak. We can choose to push back against this narrative. It is not set in stone. Maybe it exists as a phenomenon, but it's not normatively desirable. It is not a justified narrative. It is a made-up race, just as, for instance, you might say the kind of Potemkin elections that take place in facade democracies feature races, but we all know who's going to win before the race is even run. So that's my answer to your first question. I think that's a very, very pertinent observation, but it doesn't deter or undermine the broader logic of our arguments per se. Secondly, on superintelligence. Now, I'm of the view, and I share Boris's view here, I don't think AI in the short to medium or even long term is ever going to recreate or, entirely authentically reproduce the human experience. For as humans, we have vulnerabilities, we have insecurities, we have imperfections, we have, undesirable defects that are nevertheless desirable on a more fundamental level. So AI is not going to do that. It's not going to be, another human being. We're not making another man, so to speak. And yet, what I do think is going to happen is we're going to end up with AI in 10 to 15 years' time that can perform 80 to 90% of human functions, perhaps at the same level as, or alternatively better than, their counterparts, which means that for 70 to 80% of our population, they're going to be hit with very real and pressing concerns. Not so much of unemployment per se, because it's always possible for them to find more jobs, new jobs, better jobs, quote unquote. Or where not, so they're going to find these better jobs, that's a question, but they're going to find some forms of employment that's possible. But the real question here is what's going to happen to the quality of employment? What kinds of jobs are we expecting humans to do in 30 years' time? Labeling data? Watching AI-produced videos and giving a thumbs up or thumbs down? Serving as Instagram influencers using AI, enabled by AI. Here's the latest, horse shampoo, or here's the latest, bath soap that you can consume, and I'm going to demonstrate this using AI that recreates a likeness of me. I mean, these are all possible jobs. No one's denying that, and that's why I don't think there's sort of much hypothesized doomsday scenario of mass unemployment is going to come through. But what I would posit instead is going to occur is mass underemployment as a result of superintelligence. You're going to get a pretty nice and slick upper middle, upper class of individuals who know how to harness superintelligent AI to make even more money, to accrue even more influence and also leverage over politics in the world. But you're also going to have folks who can't do so, who lose out because of their being estranged and also alienated from these institutions of academic and knowledge power, who are basically shut out of this increasingly bifurcated economy where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. As Leonard Cohen predicted in Everybody Knows, which I think is a fascinating tune that kind of spells, the omen, or spells out the omen and the trouble of our times today. So in short, am I worried about superintelligence? Well, I'd like to think that folks like Boris and I are not going to be replaced by superintelligence anytime soon, but I could also be because I'm an arrogant and ultimately, fundamentally self-serving thinker when it comes to my own odds and chances. We'd like to believe we're going to survive the onslaught, but who knows? Maybe in 20 years' time, we wouldn't be. And we'd have, recreations or replicas of ourselves teaching in our place, whilst we end up sweeping the streets filled with fractures and fragments of broken dreams on a boulevard with that name. Thank you, Green Day. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Can I just add a quick addendum? Another sort of assumption that I'd like to discourage in these measures of superintelligence is there's a tendency to think that intelligence is linear in the proportionality of replicated behavior or successfully replicated behavior. So we say like, AI models can replicate as well as us 80% of our behavior. And then 85, oh wow, it's so good. And then like 90, oh my God, it's so good. We're like getting to something. But failures can be fantastical and like really reveal how much of a lack of understanding there still exists. I don't know if you all saw, like a few days ago, there was a viral video about a guy asking ChatGPT whether he should walk to the car wash or take his car to the car wash. And yeah, so for those who didn't, just a brief description, he's kind of like, hey, ChatGPT, I want to wash my car and the car wash is 100 meters away. Should I just walk there or should I drive? And then the answer is like, well, since it's 100 meters away, it will be actually very good for you and the air is clean if you just walk to the car wash. And he's like, oh, okay, but then how will my car get washed? And they're like, well, you just bring what you need, and at the car wash, they're gonna wash your car and it's gonna be sparkling clean. And he's like, but anyway, so you see, and it's like when we see things like this, we feel like, wow, like they can solve math Olympiad level problems. Yeah. They're so good. And then you're like, wait, but there's like no understanding there. Anyway, of course, every time this happens, next time, and if you go and ask, ChatGPT now, I'm sure this is not going to happen. You won't be replicating this. Oh, it does? Oh, that's amazing. Okay, great. But like the problems get patched up, and then we feel like, okay, now it's like better, but other things arise. But this notion of internal understanding, I think, is worth thinking about. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Great.
Thank you for the great questions, Steve.
Please, next question.
My name is Lacey Wright, and I am a retired Foreign Service officer from the State Department and a member of this club. My question is whether there is any role in the regulation of AI with the United Nations or any of its numerous specialized agencies. It is a forum that every country belongs to, so you'd have that. You'd probably need to add a huge amount of expertise, but what about it? Does the UN have a role, and is the UN, by the way, playing any role now?
Good question. Brian?
That's a really good question. Of course, the UN has set up a number of task forces and committees, advisory panels, where they've brought in academics from, China, the US, the UK, the EU, notably, actually, a pretty wide range of voices that cut across the political spectrum, so to speak. And the intention there is to have a representative body. So I think there are around 20 to 30 countries represented in terms of their scientists, and even then, of course, these scientists on the panel are not, they're told that their mandate is to represent humanity as opposed to represent a specific country per se. So all of that's in place, and I think we need to give credit where credit's due, where the UN is trying to have, and to provide the platforms and spaces for these voices and academics' testimonies and views to be at least somewhat broadcast and disseminated. But, and this is a pretty big but, and I think it's a pretty predictable but as well, coming from the both of us. The UN, unfortunately, has no real teeth when it comes to AI regulation and governance. Because a significant number of the players that are spearheading and pushing forward developments here are either clandestine and basically covert, so you can't trace them or find them. They might be embedded within state security apparatuses, or certain think tanks are innocuously named, affiliated with one or more countries, so to speak, that do not have transparent governance structures to begin with, or they are, of course, large private corporations. And what exactly can the UN do to, say, Anthropic, or OpenAI, or Google, especially given the deep intertwinement, right, between the expert and advisory networks the UN has, the funders, nominally governments, but also in practice, to some extent, the influence of lobbying blocks behind the funding by individual governments, behind the UN, and of course, these corporations that we're talking about here. So I'm skeptical because I don't think there's a very clear and direct chain of answerability and accountability, and nor is there political will and resolve to get that kind of coordination and alignment in place. And additionally, of course, the UN, in the absence of very specific peacekeeping operations pertaining to the UNSC, it by and large doesn't have the sort of enforcement mechanism that, say, a sovereign state has, whether it be freezing their bank accounts of other illicit actors, or putting corporate entities onto an entities list or a list of sanctioned entities. That's not something that the UN per se is able to enforce and see to the effective implementation of. And so whilst I'm sympathetic towards the view that we need more multilateral engagement, and of course Boris and I have a subsection in one of our chapters talking about this, I personally am more pessimistic and cynical as to the efficacy and efficiency of such institutions. So I'm sorry to pour a downer on that one, but that's certainly my 2 cents of words, so to speak.
Sure. Next question, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jared Trinetkamol. I work as a government affairs consultant, and I work at the intersection of like geoeconomics, tech, and policy. And I sort of had like a follow-up question to that gentleman's question on the AI race. You both made in the argument that to some extent there is no clear end to the AI race. And I know this might sound kind of a silly question, but is it possible that the end isn't necessarily a finish line, but more of like a structural gap? Like, could we think of the AI race as less as like a sprint to AGI or some sort of hyper super intelligence, and more of like, you know, like the British early industrialization back in the day, where, you know, the winner isn't the first to cross a specific line, but more of one whose early lead kind of compounds into like decades of structural or economic or like strategic dominance on the world stage?
Thank you.
I reckon that's a brilliant question, right? And that's also an important question that's reflected by the discourses surrounding abundance. I didn't bring abundance with me, but that's also a book that was, you know, poring over a couple of months ago. I guess the reason why, as a political scientist by training, I tend to be a bit more skeptical about the claim that, you know, basically, and I'm going to lay out the argument first and then critique it subsequently. Premise 1, whoever possesses a decisive lead in AI is able to achieve and unlock significant economic benefits and opportunities at the expense and to the exclusion of other counterparts. If not temporally, then substantively, because it's a sort of first to X, Y, and Z. Maybe X is a moon, Y is Mars, and Z is as pilotless travel in space, okay? So that's premise 1. And premise 2, this is something, or AI is such an important critical determinant that it really outflanks and outweighs all these other competing considerations and parameters governing the outcome of that economic competition, which then justifies the conclusion we need to win this AI race at any and all costs. Similar arguments can be found in, for instance, the nuclear, you know, race that we saw, right, between the US and the USSR, and of course US and China to a more limited extent, space as well in the 70s and 80s. And I would actually draw upon these 2 races, not because they are functionally equivalent, given what Boris has already analyzed just in the differences between them do exist, right? But let's just assume that there's a degree of analogizability there. What was the end outcome of that race, you know, in a case of the space race? Well, we saw the USSR essentially commit, right, to significant state, top-down, centrally led planning, you know, with the aim of surpassing and overtaking the US, which obviously came at the expense of many other important parts of its economy, and indirectly contributed towards, of course, the arms race that was undertaken, and then eventually the arms race and the toll of the arms race collectively combined with its foreign policy exploits and follies, and Afghanistan and beyond contributed towards the demise of the Soviet Union. So from this we can see, you know, racing ahead in this race could be pretty risky, especially if your own economy is not up to snuff. Another observation one can make, though, is the winning of this race really worth all the costs and all the prices that collectively citizens had to pay? In the case of the space race, it seems to us that the answer is relatively clear. Well, possibly, right? It's clearly possible that a space race, all things considered, might have yielded more benefits than harms overall. But what about the race when it came to nuclear weapons, right? All these, you know, the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, all these bombs that were developed, only for us to now try and put the genie back into the bottle decades on and still failing to do so, despite our attempts to drive forward nuclear non-proliferation. So when viewed through these lenses, the gist of my answer here is, yes, that is a plausible interpretation, and a very charitable interpretation, may I add, of what the race looks like. But my worry is this is not a race that's worth, you know, 95%, 99% of the world's clamoring over, especially when you think about it, right? And this is something I hinted at just then in my answer concerning political and regime types. Ultimately, the regime type matters, but it may not matter as much as the power distance and disparity between those who are truly in positions of economic, security, and military and political power, and those who lack such power. And that is also the biggest premise and assumption, I think, the abundance argument, and also the let's win now, let's lock in the dividends, let's, you know, basically become the strongest economy there is in the world. That's where both arguments fall apart. And that's because ultimately, the extent to which an economy is successful, the extent to which the quality of life of a state is good, is not contingent upon how large the pie is in some abstract sense, but on the distributive processes and the means of allocation that determine who has access to the fruits of that pie baking process. And this is where I think abundance advocates are either pulling the wool over our eyes or just naive, or as some leaders might say, simple and naive, too simple, sometimes naive, okay, and too young as well. That's a quip. So fundamentally, it neglects, right, that these abundance of benefits are rationed and gate-kept by a very selective crew of individuals, whether they be members of the political après-chic and elite, or alternatively, the sort of dominant players in the money political scene that we see in a status quo. So long story short, I don't think it's that simple, and even if there is indeed immense material benefits that are to be accrued, they would flow into the hands of the few as opposed to many out there, and that's my answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Please.
Yeah, hi, hello. I would like to refer to that point that you just made. Tomasz Augustyniak, I'm a Polish journalist dealing with Asia Pacific, and what I find really inspirational is what you said about the role of middle powers, and I would like to ask you about the current global policy making regarding AI. So we have just seen the Global AI Summit in Delhi in India, and you are clearly advocating for a more normative approach towards the development of AI. So I just wonder what your assessment is about what has happened during that summit, and to what extent India is, or you would consider India as one of these big powers that are just trying to get to the big table, or an actual advocate for middle powers, because we have seen both Narendra Modi and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying things like, oh, we do not want the billionaires to control how the AI development, a couple of people who would be in charge. So there has been that push about democratizing of access to the AI. But then we've got a pushback from the United States that clearly say that we do not want any regulation, and at the end, in the final declaration, we have nothing about global regulation or global security. We've got some slogans about democratizing AI, but there's nothing really tangible and nothing really that could indeed change the structure and the policy making. And I guess what needs to happen for the global policy making to create a more equal access to resources, also given the reality that the technology and the computational powers are largely within the United States and China. So that's the reality that we also have to face.
Great. India, middle power.
I was reading S. Jaishankar. What a fantastic diplomat. Incredible. I was reading his India Way, which was given to me by a friend of mine who's a mid-ranking Indian diplomat. I was reading it because I'm heading to India next week for Raisina. So I obviously had to do my homework, and also because I'm a massive fan of Jaishankar for a number of reasons, having observed and read and watched his speeches and speaking many a time in the past. And one thing he said that really resonated with me was, I think in a segment of the book, probably page 60 or 65 or so, he talked about the fact that there's a lot of puzzlement from observers of Indian foreign policy these days. How could it be that India on one hand would have a Howdy Modi, would host a Howdy Modi, right, festival in the States, and yet also, have its leaders be seen shaking the hands of Russian leaders in St. Petersburg or indeed in Moscow at the Valdai Club conference? On one hand, it talks about, of course, the centrality of peace and democracy and engages with the European Union on those terms. And yet at the same time, it has no qualms and no issues whatsoever, emphasizing its long-standing ties with non-democracies, whether it be Russia, Vietnam, or China, CF, of course, the SCO meeting in Tianjin last year. So these are sort of paraphrased versions of Jaishankar's comments. And he said, what fundamentally folks don't realize about India is that India is heading into a phase of greater confidence, where the forces are converging such that multi-alignment is not an opportunistically fueled and driven posture, but a fundamental tenet of India's foreign policy. And so it will be friends with everyone because it can be friends to everyone, and because everyone and all wants to be its friend. And that in turn goes to show, in my view, the potential that India has as an important anchoring middle power in the AI race. Strategically, it can negotiate and lobby, right, and deal with both the US and China and the European Union and Japan on its own terms, but also tactically it is able to build coalitions not just of convenience, but of tactical solidarity across multilateral, plurilateral, and also minilateral organizations and blocs. And of course, just to add in an additional element of strength that it has, it's the immense human capital that India has. India produces almost as many engineers as China does, right? And for those of you who are wondering, no, I do not think China is run by engineers whilst the US is by lawyers, so that's my, but that's for another day where I can offer my thoughts on Dan Wang's book, but that's an aside. You know, but what is clear is that China and India are crucial reservoirs of human capital when it comes to STEM and engineering. But the challenge for India, as identified by Jai Shankar, but also Ajit Doval in his recent remarks, is to retain these talents, is ensure these talents stay and build in India, as opposed to flowing, you know, abroad, into the States, into the EU, into Southeast Asia, into the Gulf, right? And of course, you know, much of this would depend as well on the immigration policies coming out of the White House, where ironically, you know, Trump has perhaps inflicted the greatest amount of damage on the US-Indian relationship and contributed the most towards world peace by pushing India closer to China. And that is perhaps a single and indeed a reasonable claim to winning the Nobel Peace Prize 2026, but that's an aside. You know, back on your question, right, I would say India has immense potential and promise, and yet I'm not going to end without offering my caveat. And my caveat is about demonstrating and establishing the kind of legal infrastructure, the robust protections, the weeding out of red tape, as well as the providing of a promising, fertile soil, the soil for talents that are developed and cultivated in India to see hope and not just, you know, staying there for 5 years, 10 years after graduation from the incredibly competitive IT system, but to stay and build. And if India can get its act together, wow, that's going to be quite a formidable behemoth when it comes to the AI race overall, especially if it also doubles down on consolidating its energy ties with the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. It might be a bit tricky on Saudi, but certainly on the front of UAE and Qatar, I think India's got quite an interesting relationship there, not just through its diaspora, but also in terms of realignment subsequent to, of course, events in October 2023 in the region. So that's my take on your question.
Have you just said that they consider themselves taking part in the race?
I don't know if they do, you know, because the interesting thing about Vishwaguru as a philosophy, to become the world's teacher, is that India's not really keen on racing against any other country. It's more interested in sort of leveraging off and serving as a conduit towards knowledge for all other countries. And this is not just propaganda. I'm not putting out BJP propaganda here. Maybe you might think I am. But I certainly think that the Indian people, at least the diplomats in the strategic spaces I speak with, they're very open-minded about working with as opposed to working against. You know, they're not trying to beat China, they're not trying to beat the US, even though, you know, you've got standalone examples of ultranationalistic narratives, right, that assert that India is going to be the number one, but that I don't think is reflective of the mainstream consensus in the establishment, and nor is it, for that matter, you know, necessarily something that's good for India, right, given I think India's ICT sector is very much susceptible to the sort of automation-induced unemployment surge that we're looking at here, and therefore there's a potential sort of obstacle and vested interest to full implementation of AI-based automation. And secondly, if anything, the ICT and service lead of India renders it a natural complement to, as opposed to rival to China, with China's relative prowess in the advanced manufacturing sector. So the two can work together, but a key prerequisite for that is I think the Chinese really need to understand India more and better, and to a lesser extent vice versa. The ball's in China's court in this one. When it comes to bilateral relationship, both Modi and also Manmohan Singh have undertaken many steps in trying to repair the relationship, and of course, you know, with varying degrees of efficacy. Now the question is, though, with Donald Trump back in the White House, is Beijing seeing an opening in India that would push it towards more conciliatory and also, dare I say, peace-conducive, de-escalation-conducive actions along the LAC? That's probably the key determinant on which the Sino-Indian relationship's future rests. Thank you.
Can I just jump in quickly to also address the last question about your question about the sort of race framing? Sorry, I'm going a little bit out of order because I was thinking about it. I wasn't sure how I would respond. I guess the classical Adam Smith argument in favor of cooperation, like it is an argument that, you know, cooperation will maximize the size of the pie, but it can't give you a distributive argument. It can't guarantee that your share will grow monotonically with increases in cooperation. So the point you make, it's a sensible one. Like, let's say you're the US and you think to yourself, like, okay, well, if we kind of like increase that margin as much as possible, we think that we could get, 10 points of utility, and if we cripple all the other competitors, the other competitor gets 1 point of utility for a sum of 11. And we can say, well, through economic cooperation, or in this case, cooperation in research and development on AI, materials, etc., we can guarantee that the sum of utility will be greater than 11, but we can't guarantee that your share will be greater than 10. And that takes us to the first question, because that's why philosophy is particularly relevant. As an economist, you can just sort of focus on economic gains, but you don't have to think too much about distributive consequences. And now there really is a hard question of like, well, if that's true, then why not? Why shouldn't a country try to, basically cripple everyone else? That is, in a sense, how mercantile economies worked for a very long time. You can develop a robust system of colonialism and try to exploit as many countries as possible while it, while it benefits you. So we sort of, we have a kind of narrow, like, rational choicey point, which is that it's not a race in the sense that there are multiple equilibria. It would be rational to do that, but it would also be rational not to do that. If both are cooperating, no one has an incentive to deviate. But I think your question is a good one, because it forces us to think like, but what if what if this player has formed the belief that that is what they want to do? How do you like persuade them otherwise? And that's kind of hard. That's not something mathematical game theory can answer. It's useful for analyzing strategic situations, but how to do that, that's like a question of persuasion and talking about shared interest, and I don't know what else. Yeah.
Please. I guess final 2 questions? 3? Is it 3?
My name's Yeshua Moser Pungsuan, and my question is coming from my membership in the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. This is mostly made up of scientists, professionals working in the field of artificial intelligence and robotics, but we're looking at this in the framework not of just artificial intelligence, but specifically how this relates to weaponry. And so we're looking to put some types of controls on that, and we attend the 2 UN forums that are discussing that. And my question's for you, Brian, if you have any insight on it. As the advocate who speaks to the governments, back in 2015, we have a group of states that we work with, mostly the middle powers, who are in favor of seeing some type of control on algorithmic weapons. China was very friendly with us and working with us at that time. Today, they're not so friendly. It's 10 years later, the world's changed a bit. Do you have any idea what influenced their policy change?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Cool. First of all, I commend you, and I thank you for your efforts. And I really think what you're doing is incredibly pivotal, going back to the question we had about the UN and the UN's role just then. What changed over the past 10 years coming from the Chinese leadership? You can observe this through, I would say, 2 data points. And I think the first data point is the differences in wording and also emphasis between the 14th five-year plan and the 15th five-year plan recommendations. So the recommendation document came out for the 14th five-year plan approximately 6 years ago. At the top of the list of priorities was tech self-sufficiency and also essentially the ability on China's part to have innovation, self-sufficiency, autonomy, tech. The number 2, supply chains, alignment and harmonization. The number 3, something vaguely along the lines of bolstering and stimulating a single market across the entirety of China. Last October, when the 4th plenum concluded, the recommendations document came out with a pretty interesting reversal. And that reversal essentially placed technological upgrading of supply chains as number 1, tech self-sufficiency and autonomy or innovation as number 2, and number 3, to some extent. Again, it was about bolstering demand and also facilitating greater single market alignment, but with a greater emphasis upon consumption and also investments into a safety net for individuals. What this rearrangement in policy priorities reflects, right, and this is where we're get into tea leaf reading, sessions, or what I call the finer aspects of understanding Chinese politics, is a reflection that the Chinese leadership had placed between 2017 and 2022, and also 2022 and 2027, essentially, significant emphasis within these 10 years upon building up tech self-sufficiency to the point where now I think it feels relatively comfortable and confident about the state, and that is why it's also more open about the existence of open source AI as compared to when it was, say, 5 to 6 years ago, when open source AI was seen as a means of leaking state secrets and viewed with significant suspicion in a Chinese state per se. So the first development here, therefore, indirectly speaks to this you can say, zealous pursuit of self-sufficiency, of securitization of data, of AI, of innovation of tech over the past 10 years on the part of the Chinese state that essentially enabled the rise of a group of conservative policy advocates within the Central Committee and also lower down saying, look, we've got to understand AI through security lenses and security lenses through basically military and also both kinetic and non-kinetic, both physical warfare and also non-physical warfare lenses. This is not necessarily a development that has been fully enacted or implemented just yet due to pushbacks from those who, of course, advocate a more economically and civilian economy-oriented approach to AI development, but it's certainly a very dominant ethos that we've seen steer Chinese thinking about AI away from the more sort of multilateralist and open, collaborative mindset that you saw 10 to 15 years ago towards a more closed-off mindset. And yet, with a recent reversal in policy priorities, as well as China's attempt to court and accrue more soft power with a global AI governance and the global AI initiative and the 4 other global initiatives which I talked about on a podcast with Erica Lander last September, I think what China's trying to do now, and has been doing over the past year or so, is to again steer away from being purely security-minded and fixated when it comes to AI development, and also acknowledge the soft power benefits of being seen as a responsible player in global AI governance. Where does that lead us? Does that create more openings for concrete breakthroughs and substantive changes? I don't know. But what I can say at the very least is, these policy discussions and debates, they do ebb and flow. And trends and undercurrents and also countercurrents, they do ebb and flow in Chinese politics. And understanding them does matter, so to speak, in enabling us to make sense of the directions of where the wind blows, so to speak. And the second data point I'm not going to spend too much time talking about here is October 2022. Chips and Science Act, of course, which was passed by President Joe Biden. I had the pleasure of actually meeting Secretary Kurt Campbell when he dropped by Hong Kong last year. And of course, he was back then, an important architect to some extent of Biden's Indo-Pacific policy and also tech security policy as well behind the scenes. And of course, that act itself, right, really crystallized the fears amongst austere bureaucrats and politicians in China who felt that the US was keen on kneecapping its technological growth and that therefore any and all attempts to share the fruits of its innovation could be weaponized by hostile foreign forces. Was this verdict and view accurate? Was this a justified assessment? I'm not going to comment on that because obviously this is what they decided was indeed the verdict and the interpretation of the state of affairs. But one thing's for sure, the intensification of Sino-American rivalry and a sharpening of attitudes and also focus upon advanced and sensitive technologies most certainly meant that both Beijing and Washington alike saw or began to see the race and the dynamic through lenses of a race that was zero-sum, as opposed to perhaps something that we and Boris, here Boris and I are championing, which is the view that actually this is a game where you can have more than one winning party and also a game where you can have more than one losing party, right? And that again is very sadly what I call the tragedy of great power politics 2.0 in the context of AI. Thank you, John Mearsheimer. Yeah.
Final question?
Easy one for you. My name's Neil Cotton, no affiliations, although I am developing a SaaS, AI, agentic, some kind of a something. Do you think in the mid-1700s there were people gathering in rooms like us, fretting about the forthcoming industrial revolution, and if so, what could we learn from that? Brian, you're limited 1 minute.
Do you hear the people sing? Sing the song of angry men. It is the music of a people who would not be slaves again. Look, in the 1700s, political mobilization and organization was likely difficult in most countries, even amongst the most advanced in democratization. Public awareness and understanding of the challenges of technology were likely also limited. And above all, the Industrial Revolution that came and the Victorian era of prosperity that precipitated it and also followed it. I would say by and large that was not so much a fundamental ontological shift in the way economic activity should be conceptualized insofar as a paradigm shift in a means of economic productivity, right? So it's a bit like saying, I'm going to give you an extra pair of wings as a plane, or as a pilot, I'm going to give you an upgrade to the model. Okay, so you're no longer flying on diesel, you're flying on an alternative, alternative source of energy and fuel and whatnot. But that doesn't change the nature of the activity you're engaging in here. What we're seeing here with AI, though, is something that could well be ontologically different, right? And that's because for the first time in human history, and setting aside children, which of course kind of fit the description here, we are dealing with agents that are very hard to control, very hard to know, and very hard to hold accountable individuals for, and are able to replicate vast swathes of what we currently do as human agents without our supervision and also monitoring. So kind of like children, right? Especially when you think about all the nappies that you have to change, training data, changing nappies. But on a slightly different note, does that therefore mean that we should resolve ourselves to doomsdaying and scaremongering? No. I don't think the future is written. I think the future remains indeed very much unwritten. And indeed, if we'd like to be at the table to eat like you guys are, as opposed to being eaten at the table, we've got to seize the initiative and recognize the room and also scope for our agency, even amidst times as bleak and challenging as these. So thank you very much for that question, and I hope I answered it in less than 2 minutes. So, Boris.
I think I can do like 10 seconds. I am skeptical that the build out of data centers is going to be like the steam engine or like the development of railways. I feel it's more likely that we're duped into inadvertently subsidizing a certain kind of infrastructure. But the counter argument is that we don't always know what unintended or unforeseeable uses of infrastructure are going to be. And so in that case, I hope I'm wrong, and that there are incredible uses that I'm skeptically not seeing. But
all right. On that note, I would like to, you can talk to them afterwards. And on that note, I would like to thank both Brian and Boris for their thoughts and very fruitful discussion on sort of geopolitics and AI. Of course, when that book is out, I will hopefully we can continue the conversation, and maybe I can continue the conversation with the Cambridge University Press as well to bring some over here, and I'll inform the membership. Just a few adverts for the next few events. This evening we have an outside event by the British Embassy and UN on the future of development cooperation, opportunities and challenges in the Asia Pacific and beyond. Start at 6:30 p.m. this evening here. And then on the Thursday evening, we have Asia 2026, Riding the Fire Horse, Fault Lines, Flashpoints, and the Battle for Influence. That will be a very interesting panel discussion as well. And on next Monday, we have a panel on Asia Security Order Influx, the role of U.S. allies. That's on 2 p.m. on Monday. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and please give them a round of applause. All right, guys,
Thank you very
care.
much. Thank you.
Have a good day.
thank you all.